Hey guys, welcome back. We are entering the final stretch of the hunting season, and while there is still time to tag one of those older neighborhood bucks, this is the time of the year where we really like to start to shift our focus towards doe management. So in this video, I kind of want to talk about a few reasons why you might want to harvest a few does off your property before the season ends. And guys, there are so many different things that we can talk about with doe management that in today's video, we really are just going to be scratching the surface. We are not going to cover everything as it relates to doe management, but we are going to talk about a few reasons why you might want to consider harvesting does off your property and a few ways that you can figure out whether or not a doe harvest is needed. And right off the bat, I want to talk about why doe management and harvesting does is so incredibly important. The first having to do with your local habitat, the second having to do with the health of your local deer herd, and because I know a lot of you guys come here for a hunting strategy, why harvesting does and doe management can increase your hunting opportunities. So first, let's talk about how doe management can have a huge impact on the local habitat. Every area is going to have what's called a carrying capacity, or how many deer can that area support with the food and cover that's available. And every area is going to be a little bit different when it comes to the carrying capacity. Every area is going to have a different quality of cover. They're going to have different food sources available. Each area is going to have a different deer density. And the deer density is the number of deer per square mile. So how many deer you can support on your property is going to be different than somebody else. And this is definitely not something that's one size fits all. But one thing that we want to make sure that we're managing as property owners is the amount of deer on our property to make sure that we do not get close to or exceed the area's carrying capacity. If the area that your property is located in ever gets to the point where it's exceeding the carrying capacity for the local deer herd, that can have a serious detrimental effect on the local habitat. During the winter months when those food sources are diminished, if you have too many deer in your area, they can move through like locusts and wipe out all of those preferred food sources. The preferred woody browse, those late season food plots that you planted, if there happens to be any ag fields still standing, if you have too many deer in the area, they can wipe that all out. And you might be thinking, well, this is why I'm doing the habitat work in the first place. I'm planting the food plots for the deer. I'm cutting these trees down to let sunlight in, to start that early successional growth, to feed the deer throughout the winter. But if you have too many deer in your area and they're wiping out all those preferred species, that can really set your property back. They're going to come through, they're going to clean out the preferred species, and there's still going to be seeds in the seed bank with those preferred species, and so they're going to grow back. But if you don't manage your doe population, it's going to happen the next year, and the next year, and the next year. And what can happen as a result is those less desirable plants, which have not been overbrowsed to the point where they've been killed, can really start to take off. Again, your preferred species are getting hammered to the point where they're getting set back, they're having to regrow, and those less desirable species, which have been left untouched for the most part, they're getting a chance to grow, and in a few years, they can really start to choke out those preferred species, and then you're gonna have to start the whole process over again. And as a property owner, you also want to look at the destruction of your habitat from a financial perspective. How much money are you investing into your property, regardless of what you're doing? Each property is a little bit different, only to have the deer herd destroy your work because your property or your area has exceeded the carrying capacity, which means you're only going to have to invest more money into your property to get back to where you were. And so by doing your best to manage the doe population, by harvesting a few each year, you are giving your habitat a little bit of relief by hopefully keeping your area within its carrying capacity. Now let's shift to the second reason why doe management and harvesting does off your property is so important. And that's because it impacts the overall health of your deer herd. If you have a deer herd, like we talked about in the first point, that's going through and wiping out the food sources in the area, destroying the habitat, wiping out your food plots, that's going to have a negative impact on the overall health of the deer herd. Like we talked about earlier, every area is going to have a different carrying capacity, but if your area exceeds its carrying capacity for the local deer herd, there's a decent chance that the deer are going to move through and wipe out those winter food sources, meaning that the deer herd is going to have to go weeks, maybe months without food until spring green-up. It's not really hard to understand what happens next. If there's not enough food in a particular area to support the deer herd, you're going to have more winter kill. More deer are going to die over the winter due to the lack of food. The deer that do survive those harsh winter months and make it to spring are going to have to spend a lot more energy recovering from that winter. So instead of putting their energy into milk production for fawns or antler growth, they're going to be putting their energy into recovery. And because of this, you're going to notice that you're not going to have nearly as high of fawn recruitment, meaning more fawns are going to die. And with bucks, they're not going to be able to express their full potential with their body size or antler development. So fast forward to the next hunting season, if you're hunting a property where the area is exceeding its carrying capacity for the local deer herd, you're going to start noticing that those deer are not nearly as healthy. Body sizes will be smaller, antlers will be smaller, and this is due to the lack of nutrition and high stress level that comes with having too many deer in a particular area. So those are a few reasons why doe management and harvesting does is so incredibly important from both a habitat perspective as well as the overall health of your deer herd. But I also know a lot of you guys watch these videos for hunting strategies. So this last reason on why you might want to consider harvesting a few does off your property has to do with increasing your hunting opportunities if you're going for one of those neighborhood bucks. And this all has to do with your buck-to-doe ratio and how your hunting experience during the rut can differ whether you have a balanced buck-to-doe ratio compared to if you have way too many does. Most of our hunting strategy videos are geared towards what a buck is doing at any part of the year, and that's no different during the rut. During the rut, bucks can get more predictable because we know exactly what they want to do. They're trying to breed as many does as possible. They act a certain way, they move through your properties a certain way, trying to find that next doe to breed, and again, that makes them more predictable. And most, if not all, of our rut strategies are based on what we think a buck is going to do on a particular day. But one thing that can throw all of that out is having a buck-to-doe ratio that is way out of whack. If you have way too many does in your area. If you have a buck-to-doe ratio that is balanced or close to balanced, you're going to have a better rut hunting experience. And this is because a lot of these does are coming into estrus around the same time. So most of these bucks are going to get an opportunity to breed a doe. And if you're in an area with a balanced or close to balanced buck-to-doe ratio, when those bucks are done breeding a doe, it's going to take him a little bit longer to find that next doe. And because that buck has to spend more time searching for that next doe, he's going to do all the things that we've talked about in our strategy videos. He's going to travel the downwind side, scent checking that doe bedding area. He's going to move by that pinch point in between those two bedding areas. He's going to have to work for that next breeding opportunity. Again, because the buck-to-doe ratio is more balanced. However, if you have too many does and the buck-to-doe ratio is way out of whack, there's a good chance that once that buck is done breeding, he's not going to have to look very hard before he finds that next doe in estrus. Meaning he's not going to have to travel very far to breed that next doe, giving you less opportunities. So managing does is very important from a hunting perspective as well. If you want to have a great rut hunting experience, then you want to try to get your buck-to-doe ratio as close to even as possible. So those are a few reasons why you might want to consider harvesting a few does off your property before the end of the season. But what if you're someone who doesn't know if they should be taking does off their property? Remember, every property is different. Every area has a different deer density. Every area has a different carrying capacity. So next, I want to talk about a few things that you can look at to figure out whether or not you should be taking a few does off your property each year. And these are going to be just observations that you can make. There's nothing scientific about this. There's nothing that says you have to take X amount of deer off your property every single year. These are just indicators to help you figure out whether or not a doe harvest might be needed on your property. And the first one is simple. It's just personal observation while you're hunting. While we're sitting there in the tree and we're watching deer, we can get a pretty good idea as to the deer population on that property or in the area. Are we seeing a lot of antlerless deer compared to antlered deer? And again, antlered deer don't move as much as the antlerless deer, so you have to keep that in mind. But we can get a pretty good understanding as to how many deer are in the area and how many does we have compared to how many bucks we have. And if you've noticed throughout the hunting season that you have a lot more does on your property than you have bucks, then that might be an indicator that you need to harvest a few of those does before the end of the season. The second thing that you can look at are your trail camera photos if you're someone that runs trail cameras. Just like with personal observation from the stand, trail camera pictures can be a great tool to see how many deer are using your property, and you can get somewhat of an idea as to what your buck-to-doe ratio is. And again, while reviewing the pictures, if you're noticing that you have a lot of does on your property compared to the number of bucks, then it might be a good idea to harvest a few does before the end of the season. Now, those two were things that you can do during the hunting season to help figure out whether or not a doe harvest is needed. But these next two are going to be ones that you can do following the hunting season. And the third thing that you can do to help figure out whether or not you have too many deer on your property is to look at the browse pressure on your property after the winter. Just like we talked about in the beginning of this video, if you have too many deer in the area and on your property, they're gonna move through like locusts, and you're gonna really be able to notice a lot of browse pressure on those preferred species. And if while walking your property throughout the winter or during the spring, you're noticing a lot of browse pressure, that might be an indicator that you have too many deer in the area and that a doe harvest is needed the following season. Along with reviewing the browse pressure on your property, the fourth thing that you can look at in the spring is how did your food plots, especially those winter food plots, those late season food plots, how did they perform the previous season? Do you have a lot of food left over? Were they eaten down to the dirt? These are some things that you can look at to figure out if you have too many deer in the area. Now, when reviewing your food plot performance, there are some things that you need to consider. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach. For example, if you're in a big wood setting and you have a 1/4 acre brassica plot or soybeans and they got eaten down to the dirt, that's not necessarily an indicator that you have too many deer in the area. And it's more an indicator that you don't have enough food and that you should consider expanding those food plots. But if you feel that on your property you're providing adequate food, especially those late season food sources, and they're still getting hammered, eaten down to the dirt, then again, that's another indicator that you might need to consider a doe harvest the following season. So those are just a few ideas to help you figure out whether or not a doe harvest is a good idea on your property. And for most of this video, we've been talking about harvesting does and why that is a great idea for most properties. However, I did want to end the video with this. Like we talked about earlier, every single property is different. Every area is going to have a different deer density. Every area is going to have a different carrying capacity for the local deer herd. And not every property needs to harvest does. There are going to be some properties out there that need to harvest a lot of does. I would say a majority of the properties out there need to harvest some does. But again, some properties out there do not need to harvest any does whatsoever. If you are hunting and you are not seeing any deer, or you're not seeing that many deer, and you feel that you have great habitat, you have a lot of food, this is a situation where I probably would not be harvesting does on that particular property. If you're new to hunting or you haven't hunted different areas of your state, it might be hard to recognize whether an area has an average deer density or a below average deer density. But if you're hunting a particular property and again, you're not seeing very many deer, but you have great habitat, you have great food sources, again, this is a situation where I most likely would not be taking any does in an effort to increase the population. The last thing that I want to see you do if you're in an area without very many deer is to shoot the 4 deer that are using your property and then the following season not see any deer at all. So again, harvesting does is not something that's one size fits all. One property might need to harvest 4, 6, 8 does where another property might not need to harvest any. Just to give you guys a personal example of the properties that I hunt, we hunt on a property in mid-Michigan that has a lot of deer. That's a property that we, along with our neighbors, need to consistently shoot does in order to keep the deer population in check. However, this property right here, the 30 acres behind our house, we are not being overrun with deer. I would say that we have a below average deer density in this area. We have big farmers to the north, big farmers to the south, and they do a pretty good job of managing our doe population throughout the summer. So in this area, that gives us a pretty even buck-to-doe ratio, which gives us awesome hunting experiences during the rut. But because this area has a below average deer density and because the neighbors both to the north and to the south do a pretty good job of harvesting those does during the summer, I will not be taking any does off of this property. So 2 different properties, 2 different areas, 2 different deer densities. One property desperately needs doe harvest, while this particular property does not need a doe harvest at this time. But hopefully this all makes sense on why harvesting does off your property is so important, not only for the habitat or the local health of your deer herd, but also for hunting opportunities as well. And hopefully you guys understand that this is not something that's a one-size-fits-all, that one person might need to harvest a lot of does where there are, again, some properties that might not need to harvest any. If you guys have anything else to add when it comes to doe management or harvesting does, I'd love to hear about it. Or if you have any questions, please drop those in the comment section below. I'll get back to those as soon as I can, and we will see you guys in the next video.